All right, everyone, welcome back.
Hey everybody. So thanks for listening to all my jabbering. I know it was a lot. But what I'd like to do now is kind of open up discussion and talk a little bit about these different types of othering and maybe some of your experiences with those types of othering. So starting with labeling, where people essentially use a very simple, important, clear name. It's a name calling, essentially. So have any of you guys experienced this or seen this happen to other people? Let's share. Well, I'll share my own experience. So I wear a headscarf, right? And it's a very sort of overt and obvious signal that I'm not exactly like everybody else, right? Or I'm not like you, is when you're speaking to somebody else, right? And so you are immediately very clear about where you stand. However, there are a couple of other cultures that wear a headscarf as well, and especially the way that I wear it, which is a little different as a turban. And so I have gotten, I have been labeled as things that I'm not. You know what I mean? And I always think that's always interesting. It's like, oh, you're married. I get that. This means you're married, and it's like, even when I am married, but like even when I wasn't married, like that's has nothing to do with that at all, you know. Or there's a different religion and culture called the Sikh culture, Sikh, which is neither Hindu nor Muslim. They're completely a different thing. They have their own temples of worship, etc. And they'll be like, "Oh, you're a Sikh, so you can't you must never have cut your hair ever," because like Sikhs, traditionally they don't get rid of any of their hair, right? So it's like, nope, that's not who I am either, you know. And so I think there's always like a mislabeling as well that can occur. Anybody with any examples, or we'll move on to the next one?
No, we can stay there. Just give them a couple minutes to kind of like marinate on the question. I think it's interesting because I'm Muslim and I'm Puerto Rican.
Oh, wow.
Right. And I used to wear hijab when I was younger. And I wear it intermittently. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But it's always interesting for me, like the sort of shock on both sides, right? Which is like that I'm Puerto Rican and a Muslim. Right. And so people are often like from the Puerto Rican perspective, right? They're like, they have all these misconceptions about Islam often, right? I've been
narrative of her sexuality not being something that she like that was stagnant. But yeah, there's a lot of like from the queer community, there's like there's this own like if you're in a heterosexual or like heteroconforming relationship, like feeling like you can kind of lose that community and that identity. And then like obviously we live in a heteronormative society, so there's definitely that like back and forth.
Yeah. Like there's a scene in the film where she introduces her baby daddy to the table, and it's like it's so confusing for everybody, like what is going on there, you know. And it's like, it's not that confusing, it's just complicated, you know what I mean? And so yeah, certainly it's interesting, Izzy, that you say that, where it's like you hear a label, you assume it's something bad, and then when you think that you said, oh my god, maybe I am that, and it's like it's a negative, maybe I am that negative thing, you know what I mean? It's like the N-word or a variety of other slurs that can be used, where you immediately, it is something negative, it's given a negative connotation, right? And then you sort of assimilate that, and then you have to kind of break that narrative for yourself. Malia, what's your thoughts?
I'm Jewish, and I think a lot of times people often just assume that all Jews are Zionists, or especially
sure.
within this like recent uprise of like the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I think a lot of people just naturally assume you have to be Jewish from Israel, and I think this isn't just similar to what you said. Like, there's a lot of like negative connotation with like being a Zionist or being pro-Israel, and if you aren't in that, there's not really like people don't ever ask you your opinion normally. They kind of just assume, and it puts almost like a target on you. I feel like people don't, yeah, they just I have had a lot of like people say like, oh, I assumed you were because you're Jewish, and I feel like it feels, yeah, it's just kind of uncomfortable to be
Sure.
like given a label that isn't like accurate.
I think that's really interesting, especially because of now. And you bring up a very good point, because it's like, interestingly, many people who even have the experience of being labeled or being labeled a minority will still label. It will still be racist, will still have those stereotypes that they bring to the table, right? And you're immediately put in like a defensive stance, where now you have to like defend your label. You know what I mean? Like, no, but it doesn't mean. And it's a very convenient way to sort of put you on that back foot from the very jump, from those who are considered the majority of whatever that space is. So um my mom, I'm half Caucasian and half Pakistani, and my mom was a minority Caucasian person in Pakistan. So her family was there during the partition, and they stayed. They're a very small minority of like white people that live in Pakistan. And it's kind of like sometimes you can have that flip side too, where she had so much racism from the majority culture, which was not her culture in that country. You know what I mean? And so certainly I think that there are, it's for you, especially Malia, like it's a very complicated time to have to figure out what you stand for as an individual, not unlike what 9/11 was like, right? Where it was like, what, I'm Muslim, like, what does that mean to me? I don't know, and it's in hindsight an enlightening time, because it gave you a very clear moment where you had to like clarify for yourself who you are. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's complicated, certainly. Any other ideas? All right, so let's talk about a second form. Where did my slides go? Not here. Sorry, guys, I'm technically an idiot.
The slide is still up for us.
Okay, you can see it.
It said labeling, and then the next thing that you have listed as number 2 is cultural norms.
Okay, so cultural norms. So that is where we talk about what are the things that are okay or not okay in a particular culture, and then dealing with them from like your subcultures. So for example, Izzy, where are you from originally? I gotta ask, you have to ask the right question.
Well, I'm originally from New Jersey, but like ethnically my family's like Italian, Polish, German, British.
Interesting.
It's like,
and Willow, what about you? Like, let's say ethnically, historically, where is your family from?
I'm from Northern Virginia. My dad's a German immigrant, and my mom, she's like British.
Okay, cool. So, and Elizabeth, how about you?
Ours named Lithuanian.
Okay, and Malia, where does your family ethnically originate from?
My mother's side is like Poland. I guess they're Polish Jews, and then my father's side is Norway.
Okay, so there's a lot of different cultural backgrounds here that are coming forward, and you have to kind of deal with those from your families too. Are there things in your culture that are like traditions that you no longer agree with? I don't know if you, Melinda, I'm not seeing the hand raising, so I'm gonna let you.
They're not using the
Okay.
feature. Yeah. They haven't been using the hand raising
Okay, cool.
feature.
Okay. Izzy, go ahead.
Yeah.
I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the British like created the biggest empire and like colonized the world, and so a lot of like British culture is just built around that like white supremacist violence that kind of takes on its own form in America. And then obviously German nationalism is really destructive in a lot of ways. Um, Italian Italian culture is like very patriarchal, and yeah, but the other like interesting thing is because like depending on like which grandparent, it's like I'm like fourth, fifth generation American.
Sure.
So there's not a lot of like cultural like carryover or like tradition. Like there's a couple like Polish things we do on Christmas, but there's no real connection to like Europe or like real like conversations about that and like where we come from. Like it's kind of just always been like we're American default, which means like we've fully assimilated into like American whiteness, and so it's like interesting to think about how the culture I've inherited isn't really like grounded in anything. And so yeah, that's something I've been like, especially in college, like learning more about history and how the world works, is like realizing that like the culture I've inherited is kind of like pretty empty because it's like whiteness was constructed to like create state projects and stuff like that. So it's like a matter of like finding like meaning within that like hollowed out identity, and like definitely something that I want to like explore more.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And actually, I think that's a very good point. These days, there is, I mean, obviously, like it's a very new time in the sense that it's probably the first of times where white people are becoming sort of a minority culture of their own, and it's like a new feeling, right? It's also the same feeling that, for example, immigrants have when they move to a different culture, right? Because all of a sudden, when you were completely accepted and you knew exactly what you were and everybody around you was the same, and all of a sudden there is something different. And however, that particular feeling of I don't really have a culture, or I don't really have that, it's unfortunate, but I personally don't believe that, to be honest. Like, for example, I think it's a concept of time, right? So when America became America, everybody was British, but those were the immigrants, right, in a way, and they were fighting the same British colonialism that the rest of the world was fighting, right? And then fast forward a little bit, like Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, and Italian Americans all experienced a high level of racism in America because of who they were. That's why you have certain racial slurs, etc. I mean, if you go to New York, you still can be on the street and maybe hear some of those racial slurs being used against what many of these newer immigrant subcultures think of as general white America, right? So, and if you go back to, let's say, Germany, a German will certainly have an argument with you about like how they don't have their own personal culture, but they do, you know what I mean? And sometimes it's like the double-edged sword where you want to be completely accepted into a culture, and yet within that, when you really blend really hard, then you lose a lot of particular flavor. And it's a funny place to be in a lot of ways.
You know, it's funny as you have this conversation, Puerto Rican everything,
Oh,
like they
sure.
put pork in everything, right? And like I became a vegetarian when I was 10, so it was already like my mom was kind of used to that. But then I became Muslim on top of it, right? And so it was really hard for like my family could accept my vegetarianism, but the fact that they couldn't feed my daughter pork, right?
Which
And
is a
she's not
huge
a
part of the
vegetarian.
culture. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like it definitely has been a challenge, and I know for sure that throughout her life they have definitely given her pork behind my back, right? Right.
Which, by the way, is pretty
And
delicious.
so
I remember, like, like we used to have, like, my mom used to go to Weight Watchers, right? And we've always been Muslim. And my parents didn't really care about whether we ate halal or haram, but like certainly we didn't eat pork, right? And but like they used to have this delicious thing in like the waiting room where you just they're like these amazing chips, right? And only like later on in my life I was like, oh, those are fried pork rinds. But they were
that's
delicious, I
hilarious.
have to say. But yeah, certainly, and recently we went to a family gathering of some of our friends who are Puerto Rican, and she was very, very sort of concerned and aware of our dietary restrictions. And she was like, we do have a lot of pork, but like, is there like, what do we do? And Malia, you can speak to that too. That like, for example, if you're a very strict Jew, then there are things that can't touch each other, even like in the food, right? So like Jewish kosher is in a strict sense much stricter than even like halal is, right? And so she was like, but can it be in the same like space, and like a lot of like these different questions. It was again a moment to educate and sort of also create camaraderie in two different cultures. But yeah, definitely food can be a big part of culture, and those sorts of limitations can be hard. We're planning to go to Japan for the first time in the winter, and I am very interested to see what my like chicken nugget eating kids are going to eat while we're there. Because again, it's a cultural difference. It's not even a religious thing. It's just like, how are my kids going to work with sushi and ramen, or what? So we'll have to see how that goes. Let us talk about what is number 3 here?
Changing goals.
Changing goals, yes. So I think we've been talking about some of that here, especially. So Melinda, are your parents Muslim or no?
No, I converted when I was a college student
Okay.
in 2007.
Right. So for you too, there must be like, not only is there between your parents and yourself the normal sort of generational gap, the cultural gap of perhaps being American, and
Yeah,
also now a
I'm first
religious gap.
generation U.S. born.
Yeah.
My mom lives in Puerto Rico now. I mean, I always joke around that I was like the one that was like, I'm just gonna do everything entirely different.
Right.
Because we're like from rural mountain Puerto Rico, so
Oh, wow.
like people got married young, they had kids young. I'm actually a first generation high school graduate. Like
Wow.
I'm the first person in my family to go to college
Amazing.
and like get a degree. So like, and then I went and I traveled. I've been to Japan. Kids will love the tempura stuff,
Okay,
so
cool.
that'll be good. And so like I traveled abroad. I went to a lot of different countries. I learned different languages, right? And then like I am like the career woman in my family.
Sure.
And that definitely created a lot of like, conflict, right? Because there was this idea of like, and I'm also a single parent, right? So there was this idea of like, how's she gonna go get a PhD when she's a single mom? How's she gonna take care of her kid? And there was definitely a lot of those like clashes. Like I think that's why the film was so emotional for me, was because, you know, like what I could see was that like the mother just wanted her daughter to have a better life than the one that she had had.
Right.
And she was trying to like protect her in these ways. And so I think about that for like my own mom and like her own sort of like subjectivities, right? Like sort of like the well-meaning advice, like rooted in the
Right.
culture, right? And then there was always this like conflict of, and I think that all women, right, who are working mothers experience this, right? It's like you have to like mother like you don't have a career, and then like career like you're not a mother, and these things are like always in conflict and at odds with each other. But I feel like it's interesting, right? Because like you see the mother doing this herself in the film, right? And then of course, like most children of immigrant parents, you get adultified and parentified in the process,
Sure.
right? And then as you're navigating your own upbringing, it's like and like then having kids, it's like this question of like, well, how do I not also do that? How do I not also adultify and parentify? And how do I like parent myself in that process too? So
Right.
there's like so many layers. Like I think the film was like really beautiful and kind of showing the sort of like multi-layered experiences and dynamics of like trying to navigate culture and the process of becoming, right? In like in sometimes like contradiction to and because of, right, the culture that you're being raised in.
Right, exactly. And you know, as I'm an old person now, as I tell myself sometimes, right, or my body tells me sometimes, but you know, here are a lot of younger women, and many of you will look back on this conversation when you're in moments where you have to sort of experience some of these feelings. Although maybe you guys can talk to us about how that's different for you. Like I see my sons, and I believe that they will be different than my husband, or certainly very different from my father, or my you know, my grandfather wouldn't even be able to have a discussion with them, maybe, you know. But like, because the concepts have changed, the world that we live in is different. There's so much more globalization now than there was even when we were growing up. As I'm Gen X, so you know, we had like phones on the wall where we had to like sneak calls from people and make sure nobody else picked up the other phone, you know. But we also have lived through the internet generation, and now we're experiencing the sort of inevitable rise of artificial intelligence, and how that is going to completely change our world, and also the concepts that come with that. So I wonder if, like, when you hear people of my generation have these kind of discussions, do you feel like it's like completely like left field, and like probably you're not going to experience those things now? I don't know if, personally, I'm not sure that we're there yet. I think it's like a couple of generations from now where women don't have to do that double role, or there is some huge change where equality truly reigns and everybody is sharing those responsibilities together, or what? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on that from the experience that you have so far. Let me find you guys.
So just to clarify the question, Nyla is asking, do y'all as like young women in this moment feel like that will also kind of be like the challenge for you all, like trying to figure out how to navigate multiple worlds at the same time?
Willow, what do you think?
I'm not sure. because like if you're talking about like women, like a lot of times like the role of childcare and stuff and like caring after like if you do decide to have children, like that kind of realm has been usually like delegated to women. um I don't know if I see that changing, especially due to like people aren't getting richer. So it's going to be hard to delegate childcare. And I think that like a lot of times people like look at women and see that, and like based on how like men like are leaning like politically, I don't know if they would like be willing to kind of take the responsibility of like childcare and stuff on that. So I don't know. I don't really see that changing. I think women will still have to like navigate like multiple different like things at once.
Elizabeth, your thoughts?
I think what changed now changed after this. I mean, it's just change. Here's one idea and it changes. I think what keep planning ahead. That's worked. I don't know.
All right. Malia, your thoughts?
Could you come back to me?
Yeah, for sure. So you know what? Let's move forward too. I think that's really interesting because I, even in my own world, I feel like I have I am married in a traditional standard situation. My husband works, he's a physician too, just like me. We both work hard, but I am more qualified than him. I make more money than him. And we have always, despite, for example, my mother in law being an extremely traditional woman, worked equally. I wouldn't say equally, it's probably still like 70, 40. I know that's more than 100, but like, I don't want to tell him that he does 30. He probably does a little more than that. But it's still, it has fallen on me to do so much more of the parenting, as well as, despite the fact that I have my own career. But over time, and perhaps with my children, I have pushed that back some. And although nobody wants to lose privilege, there is a place where you can get equality. And I see that, for example, I have some younger sisters and they have done better than me in those cases, where my sister, like, she's very clear that she doesn't do housework and she doesn't do this and that. And like, because she is the breadwinner, like her husband is much more of the sort of primary caregiver of their children and stuff like that. So I believe that there is a way for change. And I think also that comes from like what we do with these children that we are raising, right? And Melinda, you said you have a daughter, right? So I'm sure like your daughter is being raised with a completely different perspective than, for example, you were. And I try to do the same with my sons, at least, where it's like, you're not like dad. You have to do your own laundry, like, or whatever. Like,
it's really interesting because my daughter, despite being raised by like a PhD poet, published author mom, who is making moves, is very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
She herself is very traditional about her idea of like love and relationships, and I think she's a teenager now. Mm-hmm. So we have like these conversations. Mm-hmm. And I'm an anthropologist, right? So I always think about like nature versus culture, and like how you raise your child versus like the work that the social is always doing simultaneously, right? And like where they pick up these ideas. And I think too that, to the point that Willa made, right, is that we are seeing in this moment almost like a regression in the sort of gender equity and equality that women and like non-binary people have fought to achieve for so long, right? Is that we do see like this move back towards like trad
Trad
wives
wife. It was just about to
and
say
all
it.
of
Yeah,
this
yeah.
other thing, right? And so I'm always curious to see like how that will change, like how will that impact like the changing landscape, right? It's like, and also we see how like it's taking place in politics, right? Like what does that look like, right? And what does it look like for young women who are like not queer, right? Young women who want to be married or like who want to have sort of like more traditional experiences, like what, right? Because I've always felt like feminism is about choice, right? It's like you get to choose, what kind of pathway you
Right.
want. And so it's curious to see like this attack on feminism and like women's rights in this moment,
Sure.
right? And like how that will manifest for young women, and also like how young women are internalizing this moment, right?
Sure.
And what it means for them and like the futures and like what they might be able to imagine, right? I think a lot from what I see with a lot of my students throughout the past decade is a lot of fear and anxiety about a loss of rights and autonomy, right?
And probably, I know that like today we have a set of women here, or but I also understand that there's a different perspective for the young men in our culture, and the way that they feel attacked in certain ways, and really where is that dust going to settle once you guys are the people who are running the show, and yeah, I think that's really curious, and a very good point to see that sort of like flip back, which is kind of like the anti-liberal movement or whatever you want to call it, where it's like, um, how do other young women feel about that? Like, do you find that there's it's like 50-50, like, although we would be giving up some independent rights, sometimes there are people who feel like we've taken it too far, and what did we truly gain? So you guys are hanging out with your friends, and Izzy, what is the conversation?
My friends would not say that we've taken it too far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, like wrestling between the two worlds of like being a generation that has inherited more like skills for self-awareness and self-analysis, like just through like more conversations about mental health and more narratives about like, you know, the internet can also allow you to like really choose your narratives, even though the algorithm kind of chooses it for you. Have a certain level of agency with that. And yeah, my friends are probably more like radical and like leaning towards like abolition, like at least in theory, with a lot of things. But yeah, I think like I remember growing up, like my friends and I, like within our school environment, and like social environments and stuff, like faced a lot of like sexual violence, on like different levels. And I had at one point like flagged it to administration, like something that was going on, and I wound up being the one that got in trouble. And so like I feel like I confronted that like institutional like neglect very early on, and so like that's never really left me. And so yeah, I feel like especially now that we have a president who's like openly talked about sexually assaulting women and the connections with Epstein, I feel like we're living in a culture that is like like in a lot of ways a backlash against um like women's rights and just like progressive ideas in general. But in like my individual lives and in the lives of my friends, like we are honoring our humanity and like dignity as women, and like not settling for less in our own relationships. And so I feel like there's this like contradiction of like greater freedom in our personal lives, and like those relationships can almost feel like a shelter from the prevailing or like dominating cultural narratives right now. But yeah, definitely but that's also very like particular
Sure.
to my hemisphere.
Sure.
So
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that because I think everybody has their own. I mean, we could have been five different people here with completely different social circles, and our social media looks completely different, and like our daily world view is different. Like your doom scrolling is like a completely different doom scroll, you know. And um, I I find that is really interesting about social media and internet globalization of the world is that it's not only sort of brings so many people together, but it's also um, separated people into their own groups to a large extent, which um, it's going to be curious to see how those things shape the next generation of leaders here. And the sort of opposition that you're mentioning about like your personal life, you have so much more freedom, but your like your political life or your like, you know, sort of like your like socio-political scene is so different. And I personally haven't felt like it's affected me until now. But even when we talk about social impact filmmaking, and I'm sure, Melinda, you probably have an understanding of that with sort of the limitations that are being put through universities subtly and sometimes not so subtly on what you can and cannot say in class, what you can and cannot teach, what verbiage you are and are not allowed to use, and sort of like this um, recent sort of attack on DEI. um, it's I wonder if our film would have been able to be made and received in such a way now as opposed to even 5 years ago because of the changes. There are so many humanities grants as a 501c3. We apply for these arts and cultural humanities grants. There are many like DEI specific grants, which I've received emails, which is like, we're sorry, we're defunded, active immediately. You know, and it's like, oh wow. Or for example, um, some of the defunding for DEI and stuff that happened with the Kennedy Center, which was quite um, well advertised in a way. And I wonder if Melinda, you'll speak to how you feel as a teacher currently in the climate and how that's made any differences for you.
I think it's like it goes back to some of these other conversations too, right? Like about our like subject positioning. So I was hired as a climate change disaster. I'm sorry, as a climate change displacement and decolonization scholar.
Okay.
Like those are like my fields of expertise. Um, my brain has like so many questions right now because I'm thinking about the film. I'm thinking about the process of filmmaking. I also have a children's book coming out next year.
Amazing.
Inshallah. That's in the illustration process right now. And I was part of the Highlights Foundation, had this program called the Muslim Storytellers Fellowship, which I participated in. And while we were in that fellowship, we also like were having like conversations about what types of Muslim stories get to be told. Right. And like which ones are considered like marketable. And even like as I've been like thinking about sort of like my children's book and also like my manuscript, like this question of like marketability. And I think there's like multiple camps that were existing but are also like more complicated in this moment where we do see like mass defunding of DEI and like non-traditional stories. So like one thought is about this question of like what Muslim stories get to be told, right? And it's often like the Muslims on the fringe, right? So it's like queer Muslims, it's like non-hijab wearing
Right.
Muslim. It's like Muslims that don't really practice Islam. Like I recently like watched the show Delhi Boys on
Yes.
Hulu,
Yeah.
which I thought was like hilarious, but also I was really disturbed by the fact that they had the Shahada like in the background of like this murder scene, right? It was like it said like La ilaha illallah Muhammad
Sure.
Rasulullah and like Arabic calligraphy.
Right.
And so I think
Subconsciously.
about that,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes as a Muslim, I'm like, wait, these are like sacred things. And so for me, like sometimes, and I'm curious about this, like from your perspective, like how we balance the sacred aspects of Islam with like what will sell and like be marketable,
Yeah.
like in anything that we do, right? As film, as literature, as poetry, in my children's book, right? Like I think about these things, like, you know, what are our responsibilities as Muslims,
Sure.
right? And like how we portray Islam, right? Because I mean, like as a Muslim, right? Like I know that at the end of this experience, I have to answer to Allah for like whatever I produce. I think there's that. So and those things are, I think, sometimes in conflict with like the current political moment, right? So, you know, I think about like how my perspective on like what's happening in Palestine is like digested in relation to the fact that I'm a Muslim, right? Like versus if I were just Puerto Rican, right? Like what I could say, and also like as a decolonial scholar, like what I could say, there, because I'm not, you know, like I am passing as a non-Muslim when people look at me, except for when they notice when I do wear hijab, right? But yeah, I think that in this particular moment, it is quite scary, right? It's this, you know, because I teach from like a Black, Indigenous, feminist epistemology, right? And like my students can tell you, like that's who I'm like, who they're reading in class, right? It is terrifying at times to have certain conversations, right? Especially like last week when it was the anniversary, right, of this event. And then my students had questions about what's actually happening in Israel and Palestine, right? And they're asking me. And so I feel like what I find myself doing a lot in this moment is disclaiming in the midst of teaching.
These are my personal views, that kind of thing.
Not just that, but like, you know, for example, I'd be like, well, I'm an expert in this, and from what I understand and can extrapolate from this is what I can tell you about this. But here, do your own research, and here are some resources for what, you know, where you can like do your own research, right? Because, you know, despite the fact that I, as a human being, think that all human beings have a right to life and existence and freedom and self-determination, right? Like that is my belief, right? Regardless of like where you come from, what you do. But I also find myself having to say that in this moment. I feel like it's not taken at face value anymore, right? Like, and it's interesting to me because I feel like there's also like a complexity of like who I feel like I have to make safe now in the classroom, right? Like I would say like in 2017, 2018, I was teaching at Brooklyn College in the height of the child separation immigration policy. Brooklyn College is like a sanctuary campus. We had a lot of undocumented students on campus. And I feel like back then I was like trying to protect my most marginalized students, right? And I feel like in this moment, I feel like I am very conscious of like trying not to offend my students that historically have more social power, right? So I think like it's done that, right? Like there's almost like I can feel that anxiety actively within myself as an educator, right? That I want to make sure that I don't wind up on Turning Point USA's list. Right? Yeah. Like let's just call it what it is. Yeah. And it's also like I'm saying that and it's terrifying to say it out loud. Right. Because my colleagues are on that list. And I have a colleague right now that was doxxed, had their home address, received death threats, and tried to leave and couldn't leave the US.
Wow.
Right? So like it's no longer like it's not like an abstract danger. It's like an actual danger that like scholars that are doing the same kind of work that I'm doing, their lives are literally at stake in this moment.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious, like for you as a filmmaker, right, like how you balance that, right? Like these things, like these contradictions as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
So my perspective is this. So I believe that we're in a wave, and so many of my as a nonprofit who works in this sort of niche market, we have to tread water until we can get past this, like next now 3 years or so that are left, and with the understanding that, by the way, a new administration may not change these policies, right? And they may not be as vocal about these policies, which is part of the Biden administration issue, is that although they were sort of not vocal about the immigration issue, they did not actually roll back many of those initial Trump era policies, right? And they just sort of continued them, but sort of subtly and behind the scenes. So we will have to see where it ends up. But if one can, a small company like myself can just tread water through this, we hope to find ourselves in a completely different moment in the next few years. Now, that being said, Muslim film is very hard right now because traditionally and truly speaking, there is a very large sort of, the corporations of Hollywood are generally controlled largely by the Jewish minority. So it is a very fine balance. I'll give you some examples. Well, I live in Florida, one. So I live in Tampa, I hub out of LA. Those are both very different vibes of places to live. You know what I mean? One is a super red state, one is a uber liberal moment. However, with Hollywood, there is another level of treading that you have to do. I will give you guys a very funny example, which is that a few years ago, like 5 years ago, my husband bought us all Yeezys. Yeezys are Kanye West shoes, okay? Like the kid, we all have a pair of Yeezys that they're all matching, super cute. And without really being, firstly, you have to be so aware, right, of who is being canceled right now, what is the moment right now. If you are not following politics as a Generation Xer, you might really be like, oh, I love Kanye West, like without understanding like all of the politics around that, right? And I was talking to one of my colleagues who's a young Black executive in Hollywood, and we were talking about music or something like that. And I was like, oh yeah, we all have Yeezys. And he's like, well, don't wear them to LA. Which is a very interesting example of like the sort of subtle reality of who you are talking to, right? So for me, I think one, that, two, what kind of film we're making. And that's where I think everybody in this grassroots movement has their own perspective, and each one of those is of value, right? So like I was talking about earlier, what kind of social impact film are you making, or what kind of social impact art are you making? Are you the in your face art, which is like super, super strongly worded and super political and like, I hate Trump? Like, is that your art, which is one type of art, which is also very important, right? And then are you the more subtle artist who is doing things like, for example, the Persian version, which is a minority film, which has it's a gender minority film, it's a sexual orientation minority film, it's a cultural minority film, but it's for the broader audience, because I'll give you another example from this film. While we were filming, and just a brief, when you make a film, you film a bunch of stuff, and then when you're editing the film, you lose a bunch of stuff, or you lose a lot. You may have filmed maybe 170% of the film that was actually that what you're seeing, right? Because many things get cut on the editing floor, and that may be because it doesn't need to be there for the story and non-political reasons too. But for example, in this film, there was another storyline which you don't see in much detail, which is of her past relationship with her wife, right? We barely touch on that in portions of the film, enough for us to get the story. But there were several other scenes that were in the film that we removed. Partly because it didn't need to be there and it was like too many storylines and things like that. But part of it is probably also because Sony gives us feedback on our edits. And part of that is because and what they do is then they look at it through a marketability standpoint, like you were talking about, Melinda. Like, what is going to sell, what is not going to sell, what is going to sell to the largest audience, which is the real question, right? Unless it's like something that's super niche and it's only going to target like this small market, they want to find what is the most generalizable and enjoyable story through their sort of focus grouping and audience analysis, right? So I think in this case it was more like My Big Fat Greek Wedding was much more saleable. So let's stick with the large majority of this film being about the family, not the LGBTQIA aspect of the thing, and so that got removed. It was chopped kind of basically off the block. I will tell you that very little of that was promoted in the trailer, right? And that's partly because there was a very big Iranian American and Muslim culture that went to see this film, right? So now you're balancing between two things. Now, personally, I wear a headscarf, but I'm like the liberalist person I know when it comes to my ideas, sexuality, and things like that. And so I have to walk a different line because as a 501c3, as a nonprofit, I am looking for funding from both sides of the line, and both of them don't want to give me money. There's a charity organization I work with here in Tampa. They're called 200 Muslim Women Who Care. It's a giving circle of women, and what they do is every 3 months they have a meeting where local non-Muslim charities are nominated, and then everybody gives $100. They've got 200 people. That's $20,000, and then the members themselves vote on which organization they want to give the money to, and then they sort of give them in a tiered fashion. So spreading the word that Muslim women in your community care about the non-Muslim community as well at large, right? And they also will promote member businesses and things like that. I'm a very active member there. However, they did not promote my film at all. And they were very clear that it does not conform with their traditional values that they promote, and they will not promote anything which is non-traditional sexuality. And that's what our film kind of does a lot of, like in a way. And it doesn't even do that much. If you watch the film, I'm like, this is not really that kind of, it's a pretty reasonable, close to PG film, you know what I mean? And so there is, I would say we are at this time maybe pulling back a little bit from that as we try and focus on some of so traditional Muslim people do not want to. I have an idea. My basic idea is, how can I make the Muslim female be multifaceted, which is what I am. I really hate that we like hide her in either being pedestaled as like a perfect mother, wife sort of, or she has to be oppressed and now she needs to be saved. Like there are only, and or be a terrorist. These are the three things we can be. And the patriarchy comes from both sides, right? It's like the outside viewer wants us to be one of those things, and then the Muslim man doesn't want us to show how bad he can be too. You know what I mean? Or the Muslim culture doesn't want to show how they've oppressed us. So they don't want us to show certain things like that too. And what it does is it puts us in like a really funny place where it's like, so the Muslims won't fund us and the non-Muslims won't fund us. And it's complicated, you know, at best it's complicated. But I'll give you to that. So I knew that they wouldn't really do much promotion there, but we have another film, which is a short film called American Fabric, which we're just completing this week. It's a very simple story. It follows a girl who wants to stop wearing hijab and a girl who wants to start wearing hijab, and how all of their experiences throughout their day are exactly the same until they end up at this 4th of July barbecue where they quietly resign to make the decision which is the right one for them. But for example, there's 2 parent scenes, and the parent scenes are very similar. Like, we don't know who you are anymore. What are we going to tell our friends? You know, or their families or their friends' scenes are similar because like their friends are peer pressuring them to not make this what is a different choice. However, the choice is completely different, and my body, my choice, but everybody always feels they have agency over your decisions as a woman, right? So the story is relatable. It has absolutely nothing like really controversial in it. And that film won an $8,000 grant from that same organization. So I think when it comes to film, and you're talking about funding and marketing, you have to also know who your target audience is. And that I think can be generalized to the greater world that we live in as well. And we should always be aware that our perspective is being received by completely different audiences at different times. So how you talk to your core group of friends about your values in order for them to understand those values, and how you talk to the opposite of that about your values is also equally important to know your perspective, to know their perspective and who you're speaking to. Melinda, that's true about everything that we do, whether you're giving a talk to a group of students or a large lecture hall or a great audience that's like, you know, very large, whichever one of those is, you have to sort of tailor what you're doing in a way that will be digestible. And sometimes that means giving them little doses to get them used to it. But that's part of what we do. I think it's always really important also to remember that we're not going to get instant gratification for the things that we do. There's a really great book. It's called The Quiet Before the Storm. It's about grassroots movements and how we see the end of a grassroots movement as a very large storm. For example, like the Arab Spring or the BLM movement, and how it goes into these, or even, for example, women's suffrage in British colonialism, like how you would see the end of that as like such a big movement, but how that started years, decades, and even sometimes generations prior to that, right? And those people who started and made those particular movements didn't see the change that they were creating. We're not ever going to see it, right? And that's okay. You know, when you move the needle forward, it's a needle. And it's a needle because I might die, and the work that we're doing right now may be what fuels the work done by your generation or the next generation after that. And that is where we see sort of the culmination of my goal now. And it's just, you have to be accepting of that and know that, you know, don't give up, because like, yes, your change matters, and it may not be seen right now, but like it does matter. You know, even this conversation matters. You know, maybe Elizabeth is gonna be the next president, and we're gonna know that this conversation was the one that changed everything. You know, like you never know what it is. And I think I take that with me as fuel to continue, even when it's very frustrating in times, for example, like this. All right. Any questions, guys, about filmmaking and stuff like that? Go ahead, Izzy.
I'm like starting to become very interested in like how documentaries are made.